And the position of the Republican Party right now is not, we will never give you another dime for Ukraine no matter what. That is the position of many House members. But the official position of the House Speaker, Mike Johnson, is, look, we will consider bringing a bill to the floor for another $60 billion in Ukraine if and only if you, the Biden administration, agree to a wide range of very harsh measures that will close off the border, make it much easier to arrest and detain people who try and enter based on asylum claims, and deport people out of the country. And thus far, they are insisting not on symbolic measures, but on very concrete ones, on very authentic ones, that they can go to their voters and say, look, the only reason we agreed to spend $60 billion on the Ukrainian border is because we got the kinds of things we've been telling you for years now we will get for the American border. And whatever else you want to say about Mike Johnson, and I have criticisms of him in lots of ways, including the fact that he stood up in his first speech and said the very first thing we're going to do is not anything for you, Americans, but instead for what he called our good friend Israel. And the first bill that he wanted to get to the floor was a bill to send more money to Israel. And I've had other criticisms of him as well. The one thing I will say for him is that I think he has the potential to be a very effective political operative in Washington, a very effective House Speaker. He's very smart. By happenstance, I had him on my show 2 or 3 months before he was elected House Speaker at a time nobody thought he would, to talk to him about a hearing at which he harshly interrogated FBI Director Christopher Wray about the systemic censorship efforts in which the Biden administration was engaged with respect to big tech. I said at the time I came away very impressed with his intellect, with his depth of knowledge, with the seriousness with which he talked about issues, and the integrity that I felt like he had, the kind of core integrity. I walked away with a positive impression for sure of then Congressman Johnson, and 3 months later or less, he was elevated to the House speakership, something that happened more or less almost by luck when nobody else was able to get enough votes. And they kind of finally settled on someone inoffensive. And at least thus far, he is sticking to this pledge, even though he has already angered a lot of House Republicans by making deals with the Democrats that they perceive as being too compromising or too soft on spending and debt and all sorts of other things. At least when it comes to the war in Ukraine, thus far, he has made good on his pledge that he will not allow a vote on more money to Ukraine unless there are extremely harsh and very tangible measures to close the border. Now, the problem for President Biden is that he has a lot of parts of his constituency who have truly been convinced that these kind of border security measures are an expression of American fascism, even neo-Nazism, and certainly white supremacy, because that's what they were told year after year after year after year ever since Trump descended down the elevator and made border security and a wall a central plank in his campaign. So Biden cannot let this war in Ukraine go unfunded, because his credibility was staked on the war in Ukraine, on ensuring that the Russians would be expelled from every inch of Ukrainian territory or the war would never end. The United States repeatedly promised to stick with Ukraine until that happens. So he cannot afford to be seen as abandoning Ukraine, especially while the Russians haven't been expelled from an inch of Ukrainian territory. In fact, they've been recently expanding the amount of land they control. But at the same time, if he is to give in on these border security measures and announce all sorts of very harsh clampdowns and crackdowns on people trying to come into the country, people who have recently entered the country, that the Republicans, at least as of now, seem to be genuinely demanding and being willing to hold up Ukraine aid unless they get it, it is a serious political dilemma for President Biden. Here is what Speaker Johnson said after leaving the White House today and basically announcing that there is no deal and he can't foresee a deal in the short-term future that would satisfy Republican demands that would allow the war in Ukraine to be funded.
Thank you all for being here. We had a productive meeting, I think, House and Senate leaders. The president was very forthright. I told the president what I have been saying for many months, and that is that we must have change at the border, substantive policy change. We documented 64 instances where the president took executive action or his agencies took action to create the current catastrophe that we have at the border. It is a national security and a humanitarian catastrophe. And I articulated that to the president in the meeting now. We understand that there's concern about the safety, security, sovereignty of Ukraine, but the American people have those same concerns about our own domestic sovereignty and our safety and our security. We have talked about the necessary elements to solve this problem. We passed our bill, and it has critical elements. It's a restoration of the Remain in Mexico policy. It is the end of catch and release. It is reform to the broken asylum and parole systems. We're not insistent upon a particular name of a piece of legislation, but we are insistent that the elements have to be meaningful. The House is ready to act, but the legislation has to solve the problem, and that.
Now, let me just stop there and say the following, which is, and I know maybe you've heard me say this before, but I really think it bears emphasis. The way in which he's framing this argument is important. He's framing it basically from an America First perspective, though he's not using that term. He's saying, look, why should we continue to spend tens of billions and hundreds of billions of dollars to secure Ukraine and its border against Russia while we refuse to secure our own border? How does that make any sense? Maybe we should consider paying for the security of other countries only once our country is secure, but until that time happens, he's arguing, we shouldn't be funding the security issues and needs of other countries because our own country and our own citizens are being deprived. And that makes intuitive sense, I think, to most Americans. Why is it that we would fund other countries when those countries have things that we don't have? And he's saying, once our border is secured, then maybe it makes sense to say, well, now what do we have to give to Ukraine to secure its border? The question I have, of course, that I've actually been asking for a long time of conservative politicians is why does that rationale apply to Ukraine but not apply to Israel? Why doesn't this same argument that I know many people find very convincing, that we should not be paying for the security of other countries until we can secure our own, why does that apply to Ukraine so persuasively but not apply to Israel? Why should we be paying for Israeli wars and Israeli security? And ultimately, this is an issue of Israeli border security. Remember that this part of the war, this expression of the decades-long war between the Palestinians and the Israelis began with a breach of the border when Hamas militants flew in hang gliders over the Israeli fence that separates Israel from Gaza when they crashed through the electronic gate. And the Israelis have spent a lot of money fortifying that border, and now they're saying our border cannot be secured until we go and kill Hamas. And the United States is paying for that. The United States is paying for all of it on top of the billions of dollars we already spent to Israel. And I want anyone to try and get a coherent answer from somebody like Mike Johnson. When I had him on my show, when I had Marjorie Taylor Greene on, or Matt Gaetz, or any other member of Congress, the only one willing to give a consistent answer was Thomas Massie, who said, I agree with you. I think it applies exactly the same way. Ironically, I had RFK Jr. on my show, and he was on saying all of these things about Ukraine. And when I said to him, well, why doesn't that apply to Israel? He's a vehement supporter of Israel. At the time, he said, you know what? Now that you asked me that in that way, maybe you're right. Maybe it is time that we stop funding Israel for the same reason that we shouldn't be funding Ukraine, all the reasons that I've said. We're too in debt already. We don't have anything at home. Funding these endless wars only make the problem worse. All the arguments that he said he's been making for Ukraine, and when I asked him, doesn't it apply to Israel, he kind of said, you know what, now that I stop and think about it, maybe you're right. I'm going to go and reconsider that. And then shortly thereafter, he was accused by the Democratic Party of anti-Semitism. They got that tape where it seemed like he was saying that Jews and Chinese had special genetic immunity for certain viruses that were being created. And ever since, he's gone to the far, far end of the pro-Israel spectrum with people like Rabbi Shmuley, who even in the Israeli context is a complete extremist and kind of seeking protection from him. But anyway, back then, he was open to that argument. And sometimes when I've asked that argument and insisted on an answer from people, even random people who I speak to, they will say the reason is because Israel is our ally and Ukraine isn't. I don't know how you define ally, but the reality is that so many times we've told Israel, you need to stop doing X, Y, and Z because what you're doing is harming our national security. And the Israelis said, we're not going to stop. I've showed you that so many times, going back to the 1980s and early 1990s, when the position of the U.S. government was settlement expansions are directly harming U.S. security. We need you to stop. And if you don't stop, we're going to withhold loan guarantees. And the Israelis said, we're not going to stop. We're going to do whatever we want. You're going to continue to fund us. And we have. Whereas the Ukrainians know they're in a subservient position. They know that we're giving them all the money they use for their war. And so they do what they're told. They never defy U.S. orders. That seems like a real ally. From an American perspective, I think you can make a much stronger case that Ukraine is an American ally more than Israel. But even if you want to say they're both allies, how is it that it makes sense to object to the funding of Ukraine's military needs and its security needs without first securing the U.S. border, while demanding that all that money that Israel wants go to Israel without first securing the U.S. border? I think it's just political hypocrisy and the reality of who wields political power in Washington. But this principle that's being invoked here would be a lot more persuasive if it were applied consistently. All right, let's listen to the rest.
That's the critical point. We understand the necessity about Ukraine funding, and we want to say that the status quo is unacceptable. We need the commander-in-chief of this country, the President of the United States, to show strength on the world stage and not weakness. We cannot continue with the current status quo. We understand the importance of what's been needed, but when I met with President Zelensky just last month, right before Christmas, he said that the necessary ingredient is the proper weapons systems that they need. There are certain things that are needed to ensure that they can prevail. We need the questions answered about the strategy, about the end game, and about the accountability for the precious treasure of the American people. We understand that all these things are important, but we must insist that the border be the top priority. I think we have some consensus around that table. Everyone understands the urgency of that, and we're going to continue to press for it.
Now, that was a second argument, a separate argument, which was beyond the argument that we need to secure our own border before we secure the Ukrainian border. A secondary argument was, even when it comes to the question of funding Ukraine, and he was kind of saying, we realize its importance, but he was saying, we're not going to just keep pouring money into Ukraine until we have clarity about what this mission is. What is the objective here? How do we know when we've succeeded? When is it time to come home? When is it time to end the war? Is it really never going to end until you expel every Russian troop from all of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea? Because if so, it's never going to end. The Russians will never permit that. They will do anything to stop that. And I mean anything, because they perceive that genuinely as an existential threat to Moscow. And so they want to know from Biden, what is this war? What is the mission? What is it? What are the criteria to know how it's progressing and succeeding, or if it isn't, when to stop? But also, we want real oversight measures on where the money is going. Senator Rand Paul and others have been trying to attach this to spending bills from the start. And yet Mitch McConnell would immediately call Rand Paul a Russian agent for wanting to attach oversight bills of the kind that, when it was done in Afghanistan, discovered billions and billions of dollars of fraud. There have already been indicia of this aid disappearing into Ukrainian bank accounts. There have been top-level defense officials in Kiev who have been denounced and investigated and fired for kickback schemes and bribes. You can only imagine if you're going to pour over $100 billion from all these NATO countries into what has been the most corrupt country in Europe, with leaders like Zelensky, who have already been reported to have offshore bank accounts or are connected to so-called Ukrainian oligarchs, where that money is going, how little oversight there is. And at least for now, Johnson is saying that even if we get security at the U.S. border before we fund Ukraine, we want these measures. Now, here's a New York Times report that just kind of gives the details, most of which I was just saying, and there you see the headline that suggests they, at least of now, are serious. Quote, Johnson digs in against border deal to unlock Ukraine aid, defying Biden. Hours before a meeting at, I love that framing, defying Biden, as though the House Speaker works for Joe Biden and takes orders from Joe Biden. That's his job, to quote unquote defy Joe Biden, especially when it comes to defending the majority view of the American public, which is we don't want more funding for the war in Ukraine. Quote, hours before a meeting at the White House about how to break the stalemate in Congress over aid to Ukraine, the Republican speaker signaled a compromise was not possible. And this is the issue, which is that you don't even have to believe in the integrity or steadfast nature of Mike Johnson. He has a House caucus that has made very clear many of those members are not going to fund the war in Ukraine under any circumstances, even if the border is secured. But a lot of them are apparently going on with the idea that unless we get real border security that we can go to our voters and present as authentic, not just symbolic, not just empty gestures, but harsh border security measures of the kind that Joe Biden will have a great deal of difficulty selling to his base, which the Republicans know, they seem, at least as of the moment, committed to the idea that no matter how much is said about the necessity of defeating Russia, about the way we're leaving Ukraine in the lurch, they seem willing to take that attack because they feel like they're posturing in defense of the American people. And right now, the American people view their own interest as superior to the interest of the Ukrainians. So I do think Joe Biden is in a very difficult position here. And I think the war in Ukraine is also in a difficult position. But like I said, in 20 years of covering all of this very intensively, it is extremely rare that I have seen the U.S. security state lose. And if they don't get their funding and get it quickly, that will be a serious defeat for the U.S. security state. I will believe that when I see it. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.